Hey there, community group leaders. It's good to see you guys. We are filming our very first community group leader training video. So, welcome.
Yes, it was very exciting. I hope you're probably on the edge of your seat right now.
It's kind of a big deal.
Kind of a big deal. Your maiden voyage. Here we are.
Yeah. Anyway, we wanted to talk to you just because our community groups were formed out of rooted and around this idea of mission, that we want to engage the culture around us. And yet, as we continue, just the two of us on our own journey in learning about the culture, learning about what it looks like to be faithful to Jesus in the midst of our culture, we've been learning some things that we thought would be great to share with you. And so the reality is that the culture of Santa Cruz, and this is probably not new information or shocking to any of you, but it's a post-Christian culture, right? Which means...
It means that these terms, they get thrown around maybe in church world or other worlds, but what is a Christendom culture? A Christendom, if you will, would be when the predominant values and ways of thinking about the world, about God, about things like church, there as a kind of a common shared core. Mm-hmm. And really, if you look at American culture, actually, just heard this in the podcast we're going to recommend, is the peak of per capita American church attendance was actually in the 1950s. Mm. It was right after World War II, the horrors of war. People came back and kind of picture happy days, right? But that people went to church. That was pretty common. Now, you think of where we are now in a place like Santa Cruz, and we think of 5% or less people in our community would identify as going to any church on any kind of consistent basis. So, whereas maybe even in our own community, probably back in the 60s, 70s, much higher, even if you weren't necessarily even a Christ follower, you would have identified with as a Christian, number one, and two, probably as going to church somewhere. Yeah. So we're in this other side of where it's not expected or even normative in our culture in particular and Santa Cruz specifically, to go to church even or identify. That's not common. Even if, whatever your spiritual beliefs or practices are, it's not likely that you'll say, I'm a Christian follower of Jesus and I go to church regularly. That's not common. Yeah.
And so the reality is that if we want to reach people in a post-Christian culture, it doesn't matter, if we even have Richard Gotthard every single Sunday speaking, as amazing as he is, or the best worship band in the world, or whatever it is, people aren't coming. They're not interested. And so we need to go reach them, right? This is everything we've been talking to you about for 2 years now.
Yes, because the Christendom, and even this is, if you think of back in the 80s and 90s when the church growth kind of movement happened, probably starting in the 70s, 80s. And that model was, how do we make the church relevant to people? We'll talk about the needs and things that they're feeling, marriage, family, whatever's going on in their life. And the goal was invite people to church. And the church will do a good job of, as an event or as a program, kind of pulling people in, and that's where they'll get the gospel. That's where they'll grow in their faith. And not that that's bad. No. I mean, we want to see people come to church. But what we've come in this post-Christendom season and moment in our culture is people aren't likely to just come to church. I mean, even if you invite them, not that, well, let's just say this. They're not likely to come perhaps with a first invitation, right? It's not, so it's less about us going, how do we just get the word out? Because people aren't looking for a church. It's not just a lack of information. I didn't know there was a church. But more, it's so off their radar, and Christians are off their radar. So how do we take the church to them, be the church where we go to people, build that relationship? And people say this, people need to trust a Christian before they're ready to trust Christ, or even accept a church invitation. Yeah. So we've got to be moving towards people, not expecting them to just show up here because we have a good event, like you said, or a good program. We've got to build that relationships of love and trust before people are likely to even want to come or even be willing to accept that invitation.
Yeah. And so that's probably not super new for you guys, but I think where the rub is and what we're really learning is that as we go out into the culture, right, on mission to reach our friends, our neighbors, our coworkers, whoever it is that we're trying to reach, it is statistically much more likely that we are going to get formed by them in a negative way rather than for us to end up shaping them and changing the world around us. Yeah. See, part of this idea of the post-Christian culture is that they really, they actually have embraced kind of this kingdom vision that we see in the Bible about peace and justice and stability and human flourishing and things like that. So they've really embraced that kingdom vision, and yet they don't want anything to do with the king. And so you have this kingdom without a king.
Yeah, think about in Santa Cruz particularly, think about the things that people are passionate about or get people stirred up. It is issues like justice and fairness, whether or not you agree with their definition of those things. But it is things about, we care about the environment, right? We want to care for the planet. We want to care for creation. We want people's rights to be protected. We want peace, and these are all values that actually Jesus talked about, caring for the world that God made, caring for one another, justice, fairness. And yet, if we try and take Jesus out of that, he's the source of those things, and he's the one that actually is his life in us and through us is what makes those things actually even possible. Mm-hmm. But other people around us are saying, no, we want those things, but if you take Jesus out of it and you try and pursue those things, then like Scott said, we end up being shaped by values and ways of thinking that are not necessarily informed by Christ, but by, well, a progressivism, if you will, or a way of a political viewpoint. See, take the king out, and then you're aiming for that kingdom, and then what you have is you kind of get really militant about your political view, because you go, that's right, and we have to make it, we have to legislate it, right? Yeah. We have to coerce people into believing what we want, and if you don't agree with us, then we're going to punish you. And that happens on both the right and the left, so it doesn't matter which side you're on.
Totally. Yeah, so if we want to actually be effective at Jesus' mission without getting sort of co-opted by this kingdom without a king, we need to find ways to anchor ourselves to Jesus and to be formed by him. Yeah. And so that's part of where in our community groups, we have encouraged in the past, and we're even looking at ways to do this more effectively going forward, but to anchor ourselves with these communal practices or rhythms that shape us into the form of the Jesus story, what Jesus has been doing in the world, so that we can go out and actually affect change in our culture and see our friends, our neighbors brought to Jesus and changed by Jesus rather than us being changed by them.
Right. And so how do we do that? How do we hold on to Jesus is what we're saying. How do we hold on to Jesus in our life and our life together and in our lives? How do we hold on to him and let him be the one that shapes us, as opposed to just trying to do Jesus stuff without Jesus?
Totally.
And so we recognize that it's easy to say, I want the way of Jesus, I want to do what Jesus did, and I want the outcomes Jesus talks about. But unless we're being formed consistently and communally by Jesus, then like Scott said, we're going to end up either drifting off and making it either a political movement, or we're going to just lose our steam, or we just won't have the passion or the drive, or we're just going to miss the core, which is Jesus wants to offer life in all of its forms, and these things are expressions of that. They're not ultimate ends. The ultimate end is becoming formed to be like Jesus individually and together.
Yeah. So we're going to be talking about this more this year. This is really just a very brief introduction, but three things to take away from our time today. And these resources are going to be linked to in the email that this video is coming to you in. So first is we would both strongly recommend practicing both individually and in your community silence and solitude. For me, especially over the last 3 years, that has been the single greatest way that Jesus has shaped me and changed me, is in my practice of that.
And I'll echo that. I mean, for me, that is an essential part, and it's learning to build that habit that we started this year in our message series, saying building the right kind of habits or practices in your life. ultimately, we're not going to get the kind of life Jesus has for us or that he lived unless we do what he did. And Jesus practiced a lot of solitude, a lot of silence, a lot of being with God, being in that conversation with God, in his inner life with God. And we need to do that individually, but also together. And so that's an essential practice. It's a foundational one in many ways.
Yeah, if you're not sure where to start with that, an amazing book is Invitation to Silence and Solitude by Ruth Haley Barton. I strongly suggest picking it up and reading it. If you don't have the money and you're super curious, I'll buy it for you. Just let me know.
I will too.
Yeah.
Two offers.
Yeah, exactly. So you can get 2 books out of this deal.
Good.
The second is if you're like, yes, this is resonating with you, and you're wanting to lead your community group into this kind of vision of these practices that really shape us as a community, a great new resource that just came out is an 8-week video curriculum from Saturate and Jeff Vanderstelt. It's called Making Space. I know a lot of you like video curriculums. It's got some material to go along with the videos. That would be a great way as a community group to begin that conversation around how do we want to shape some communal practices that really anchor us even as we seek to go into the world and make disciples.
And I'm guessing Scott's going to put a link to that at the bottom of this email, right?
Yes.
Yeah, so he's going to do that. And then this other, look below. And then there's this other thing that Scott and I have been tracking with. There's a church up in Portland called Bridgetown, a guy named John Mark Comer, who actually, his dad was a worship pastor here at Santa Cruz Bible, so kind of that connection. But they're really, as a church, leaning into these practices and rhythms in the way of Jesus. And so they've actually got a whole website that is just open to anyone with some different resources like this. And Scott, what is the name of that website?
The name of the website is Practicing the Way, practicingtheway.org. So you can also check out the link down there. And
it has a number of different, even things you can do individually or together as a group, ways to lean into some of these practices and rhythms. And again, how important is it that we are, it's not ultimately it's what kind of people we're becoming. Yeah. What kind of people are we becoming? Are we truly becoming like Jesus? And as we do that, then his life flows in us and through us. And then what comes out of us is life-giving. And people are drawn to that, ultimately.
Yep. Yeah, so begin to practice silence and solitude if you're not already. Figure out how to enter into that conversation as a community group, and a curriculum is a great, easy way to do that. And check out some of the resources from Bridgetown Church, John Mark Comer, practicingtheway.org. There's a podcast, Our Cultural Moment, gets into a lot of this stuff.
Really good.
Some really sharp guys, smarter than me, talking about this. So,
very stimulating. I've liked it a lot. Listen to all their podcasts and really enjoying it. So thankful for you and what you do. Love the opportunity to get to have this kind of conversation with you, and I'm so thankful for Scott and his leadership. And you guys are part of a revolution, whether you realize it or not. And we're really grateful for you.
Yeah, we love you guys. Thank you.
Okay.
Talk to you soon.